So we start with the first great global persecution, which we're calling the Roman persecution from the Roman Empire, and it's essentially running in two waves. The first wave is from 250 to 260 AD, and it starts with the Emperor Decius. After that, it's not easy, but there's another great intensification of the persecution that happens in 303 to 311 under the Emperor Diocletian and his son Galerius. So we're talking just over a couple of generations here while this persecution goes on. As we said, this is the first empire-wide persecution of the church. I often ask groups, but it's a little tongue-in-cheek, I say, if you're going to make a list of history's most successful persecutors, who would you put in your top 5? And I know it's a terrible sounding question, but I would put number 1 as Messius Quintus Decius. He was only emperor for 2 very short years, 249 to 251. But no one came closer, and this is the view of the great persecution scholar of the early church, W.H.C. Friend. No one came closer to wiping out Christianity than Decius. Perhaps it was fortunate that Christianity wasn't terribly numerous at the time. But why is Decius so significant as a persecutor? We need to go through the reasons quite carefully. The first is his ambition. Decius is the first man to persecute Christians on an imperial scale, empire-wide. Up until 250 AD, Christians are persecuted, all right, but they're persecuted locally. They're never persecuted as a group across the whole empire. Decius will change that. Usually Christians were scapegoats for something local. Remember, in 64 AD, the Emperor Nero blames Christians for the fire in Rome. And that was a terrible business. It probably carried off Paul and perhaps even Peter as well. And what he did was absolutely shocking. One of the punishments that he had was he would round up Christians, dip them in tar, stick their heads in a vat, and set their bodies alight. And then he would drive his chariot, lighted by the flaming torches of the bodies of Christians. Quite sick. But you could flee Rome and go to somewhere like Antioch, and you would not be persecuted. It was local. Other scapegoating, Marcus Aurelius was blamed Christians for earthquakes in the south of France, and they were terribly persecuted for that. But the first person who thought of neutralizing Christians as an entire community over the known world was Decius. He's the first man to see Christianity as a threat to the imperial empire and to mobilize the entire bureaucracy from Rome to Carthage to deal with them. All great social engineers who manipulate religion across cultures and mountain ranges all bob on the wake of Decius. Second thing, though, is you have to look at his strategy because it's perfectly cloaked. He says in 250, we've got to stick together, folks. The Goths are massing to the north, the Persians to the east. Let's unite and fight. Everybody should make a sacrifice to the gods to bring victory. So he asks everyone to obtain a certificate from a magistrate confirming that they've done so. Failure to do would bring death. Now immediately you think, well, how's that going to bring down the Christians? Because it seems such a simple thing. But it was a master trap, because Decius knew that Christians couldn't do this. His inside intelligence about the community was superb. He knew that Christians were completely different to all the other Roman religions because they claimed a monopoly on the truth. They were aggressively evangelistic, and they were extremely uncooperative in worshipping the national cult. They couldn't take an oath that required them to swear that there were other gods on a par with theirs. So Decius had them. But this was very clever because he was basically persecuting Christians under the guise of a pro-religious campaign. Because all he was doing was asking people to go to the temple and call on the gods to help. And Christians were going to look very unpatriotic if they didn't make these sacrifices too. So you have to admire his careful conscription of historical forces. A smart persecutor will work with history, not against it. And Decius's timing, you see, was clever because 246 AD was declared the millennium of the Roman religion. So this gave him a perfect opportunity to revive the cult and sideline anyone who couldn't follow it fully. And so it had the effect of ensuring that there would be very little cultural sympathy for the Christians. People would say to them, "Why can't you just sacrifice to our gods? Don't you want the empire to be strong?" So he creates a cultural prejudice against Christians to add to the pressure of the state against him. But the most dastardly thing about it, and this is where we're going to talk about the essential tactic of this persecution, is the crux of Decius's success. As the campaign gets going, magistrates come to him and they say, some of the Christians want to obtain certificates by bribery. They want to buy their certificates without sacrificing. Or they might be forging them, and they haven't even come to our notice. So they said, what do we do with these? Now you would have expected Decius to say, kill them. How dare they try to circumvent my will? But Decius says to them, that's absolutely fine. Let them bribe. Let them produce forged documents. Now, why is this a masterstroke? Because he's making it possible for Christians to compromise their faith. So he is sowing disunity in their ranks. His tactic is not to create martyrs. Martyrs rally people around. Martyrs show that Christ is worth dying for. No, Decius wants to create apostates, because apostates divide the community. And he was particularly pleased when, for example, bishops sometimes took this way out, because it throws the Christians into turmoil. There's a book that we're asking you to read by Robert Louis Wilkins, and he says the aim was not execution, but to weaken and thin out the Christian community. Because when you have an apostate, this divides the Christian community into the righteous and the unrighteous, the uncompromising and the compromised. And so a whole new set of questions are introduced and vigorously debated in the church. Should we take communion with those who compromised? Are they still Christians? People who went perhaps and made the sacrifice and say, well, in my heart, I really belong to Jesus, but I just had to do this. Is it really necessary to die for Christ? Would I die in vain if I refused to sacrifice? So, in addition to the pressure from the state and the culture, Decius creates pressure from within the church, because so many Christians compromised themselves in this fashion. In fact, the majority of Christians swore an oath, or paid a bribe, or concocted a forged certificate. They were called the lapsi, or the lapsed, the ones that gave in. Decius was out to create apostates rather than martyrs, and in so doing, he sowed such controversy, such consternation in the community, that it acted like a cancer, depriving Christians of the very unity they needed to stand firm while they were deep underground. He released a kind of virus that went into the very depths of the underground church. Now, he was extremely ruthless, let's not gloss this over. Many were martyred. But he knew that the strategy depended on killing some who refused to make the sacrifices, so that it was a real choice. And some felt that his strategy, over time, he was beginning to win. He might have wiped out the Christians, some argue, had he not died very soon, because, as I say, he died only 2 years into his campaign.